So I'd like to start by asking a fairly inappropriate question of everyone. I'd like everyone to raise their hand if they've had a home burglary or fire within the last year. Anyone? Okay, well, statistically speaking, this should be about 1 in 1,000 people. I'm glad to see that no one else has. Next, I'd like everyone to raise their hand if they've got home insurance protecting them against a home burglary or fire. So raise your hands, please. Okay, so have a quick look around. You can see that around, I would say that was about 50% of the people. Now, I'm not advocating, I should say that statistically speaking, that makes us all rather stupid, to be fair, but I'm not advocating for everyone to stop paying for their home insurance, but what I am saying is that, and what should be clear to us all, is that when it comes to consequences that matter to us personally, we are willing to act. In fact, we're willing to pay a 0.1% probability of insurance premiums to protect ourselves. So why is it that we're unwilling to act when we know that there's a 50% probability of permanently losing our planet's life support systems? And how, more importantly, is it that we can start to solve this global challenge whilst making our cities more livable and healthier for us all? Well, that's why I'm here today, to talk to you about a radically new way of thinking using the principles of biomimicry and biophilia, two of the best sources of new ideas that I believe will allow us to go beyond the conventional to achieve a truly amazing and restorative future. And I'd very quickly like to explain these two principles to you. So the first principle of biophilia, click, not quite, is a hypothesis that was put forward by researcher and biologist E.O. Wilson, in which he suggests that human beings hold a biological need for connection with nature on a social, psychological, and intellectual level. And that when we're surrounded by, in contact with, or in view of nature, we can radically increase our working productivity, our learning comprehension rates, and even our patients' recovery rates in hospitals. And a really good example of this can be seen when looking at the study conducted by Roger Ulrich on patient recovery rates from gallbladder surgeries. Now, in his study, Ulrich looked at two groups of patients, the first of which were allowed to recover in your typical hospital room, so views out onto brick walls, very little natural daylight, and artificial lighting, not the best conditions. And the second group were allowed to recover in rooms that were looking out onto natural vegetation with lots of natural daylight. And Ulrich found that on average, the patients recovering in the second room were getting better up to a day faster. Now, I'd like you to consider that the US spends around $5,000 per day keeping in post-operative patients in hospitals, and that on average, there are around 45,000 major operational procedures in the US per year. So what then does this suggest? That good biophilic design is worth to the US healthcare system. And perhaps even more importantly, what sort of benefits could we get if we were to apply this type of thinking to the whole of our built environment? Pretty amazing results, I think. Now, the second principle is the principle of biomimicry, a relatively new and exciting discipline, which is all about implementing ideas and functions from nature to solve complex human challenges. And a good example of this can be seen when looking at this lovely-looking creature. This is known as the dog vomit slime mold, a great name. An organism that I believe could inspire new solutions to urban transport systems. Now, the dog vomit slime mold, it essentially spreads out and locates food sources to create an optimized network. Now, in 2009, scientists at Hokkaido University, Japan, were experimenting with a map of Tokyo. They put food sources on all of the surrounding cities to Tokyo, and then and then placed a slime mold in the center. The slime mold spread out, located all of the food sources, and then optimized its connections to form a minimum distance network, which almost exactly matched the railway network of Tokyo. And even more exciting is the fact that it had taken the engineers many thousands of man-hours to try and figure this out, and the slime mold managed to do the same in only 26 hours. Now, I've just given you two examples of amazing adaptations in biology that could be used to inspire breakthroughs in the transport and healthcare sector. But as I'm sure you all already realize, these represent but a tiny fraction of the ingenuity found in nature. And in fact, the UN Conservation and Monitoring Service estimates the figure to be about 8.7 million different species in the wild, of which we have discovered and cataloged only 1.2. So when I look at a beautiful image like this, I'm not seeing a rainforest that I want to save because I'm a tree-hugging hippie. I'm seeing millions of innovations waiting to be discovered that are worth billions to our economy in new technology and an ever-increasing green job sector. And let's not forget the fact that this is all provided to us for free by nature. So I think that the overall message here is that if we could learn to do and make things more like nature, then we could help bring about a new ecological paradigm, and one that takes advantage of a 3.8 billion year research and development process. And I'd like to share with you how it is that we at Exploration have tried to apply these ideas from nature to offer a big solution to a challenge that's currently facing us. That is, how is it that we can move our cities from a very linear, wasteful, and pollutive form of consumption to closed-loop models? And to understand why it is that we need to adopt closed-loop models, I want to do a quick thought experiment with you to understand the scale of the challenge that we're facing. So I'd like everyone in the room to close their eyes, please. Don't pretend, everyone close, okay? Now, I'd like everyone in the room to imagine now that they're sat around the Sunday lunch dinner table with all of your family. All right? Whether you like them or not, doesn't matter, okay? Now, I'd like you to imagine that you've got the roast chicken, the potatoes, the vegetables, all the drinks, everything that you want there. It's now after lunch, and instead of throwing away all of your waste, you're going to pile it up in a small mountain in the center of the table. It probably forms a small mound now. Now I'd like you to imagine how that pile would grow if everyone in your block were to come down and put their waste on your table. Well, it's probably starting to now fill up your entire dining room, even probably your entire flat. Now I'd like you to imagine how that pile would grow from the waste of everyone in your street. Well, it's probably now big enough to fill up all of the apartments in your block. Next, I'd like for you all to imagine what the waste from an entire town would look like. It's probably now big enough to flood an entire street. And next, I'd like you to imagine what the waste from a city the size of Washington looks like, where there are around 700,000 people. Well, it's probably now big enough to create a whole mountain of waste that's big enough to cover a neighborhood. And finally, I'd like for you to consider the fact that we live in a world where there are 7 billion people, at least half of which eat 3 meals a day, 365 days a year. Clearly, there's an urgent need for us to readdress the way in which we produce and consume our goods. And I'd like to quickly share with you the way in which nature does things very differently. So you can open your eyes now. Now, we can see that man-made systems tend to be very extracting and very damaging to the local environment, whereas nature-based systems only use locally abundant material and are completely regenerative to the environment. Or as Janine Benyus says, life creates conditions conducive to life. We can see that man-made systems use vast amounts of fossil fuels with a lot of pollution, whereas nature-based systems only use current solar income, and their outputs of oxygen and soil are the things we desperately need. We can see that man-made systems use chemical treatment and long-term toxins, whereas nature-based systems use no long-term toxin. In fact, nature's chemistry is water-based. Then we can see that man-made systems, they create shape, and it tends to be very expensive, whereas in nature, material is expensive and shape is very cheap. And then finally, I like to consider the fact that in man-made systems, we generally design things to be discarded, whereas natural systems tend to be closed-loop and produce zero waste. And a good example of how this closed-loop systems thinking has already been applied can be seen when looking at a project called the Cardboard to Caviar project. And in an area called Wakefield, just south of Leeds in the UK, Graham Wiles started an initiative known as the ABLE Project. And he started this as a way of getting young adults with learning difficulties back into the working world. Now, Graham saw an opportunity in the waste cardboard being produced by the local shops and restaurants. And since they saw it as waste, he convinced them to pay him to take it away. Once collected, Graham and the team shredded up the cardboard, and they sold it on to equestrian centers as horse bedding. Then once it was soiled, the team were paid again to collect it, and they took that waste and put it into a wormery composting system, which produced 2 sources of revenues: compost, which they sold on, and additional worms, which they fed to Siberian sturgeon, which produced caviar, which they then sold back to the restaurant. So a very nice, tidy profit. So they managed to take a very linear system and turn it into a closed-loop model and create more value along the way. Now, Graham and the team have continued to add more and more elements to the system, turning waste streams into value. And just as natural systems tend to increase in diversity and resilience over time, there's a real sense with this project that the number of opportunities just keeps on growing. But perhaps the most important thing is that it shows how a big problem like waste can be turned into a massive opportunity. And that's what we're trying to do with the Mobius project. But for the first time ever, we're going to bring together the cycles of waste, water, energy, and food, all under one roof, and in a manner very closely resembling that of a natural ecosystem. So the waste of one system can become the nutrient for the next. So we would have a restaurant inside a productive greenhouse, like the De Cas restaurant in Amsterdam, providing a stunning setting for anyone to eat their meals. We would have an anaerobic digestion system that would be taking in the biological waste from the local area to provide heat and power for the building. And you need to remember the fact that the waste that we produce has about 90% content of water, and that water that comes out is an excellent liquid fertilizer. Next, we would have a water treatment system based on John Todd's living machine that would be treating gray and black water and turning it back into potable water again using only plants and microbes. Then we would have a fish farm that would be fed from the waste scraps of the kitchen, which would in turn be providing fish back to the restaurant. We would also have a worm recomposting system that would be taking all of the waste, turning it into compost for the growing beds in the greenhouse, and additional worms for the fish. We would also have a coffee shop whose waste grains could be used as a substrate for growing oyster mushrooms. And then finally, we would have an innovation incubator that would be dedicated to helping sustainable startups deliver solutions to urban environmental challenges. And just for a little bit of fun, we decided to design the project on a site that was a hideous space for people. I don't know if anyone's been to London, but if you do, you recognize this. It's horrible. And we found that just with a little bit of imagination and replanning, we could turn a space that was dedicated to traffic into one that was open for people to explore and celebrate the idea of closed-loop systems. However, it's important to remember that taking this type of ecosystem thinking approach doesn't just produce fantastic opportunities, commercial opportunities, there are also an array of benefits that up until recently have been considered completely intangible. However, there's a very recent new report that was produced a few years ago now, but it's called The Economics of Biophilia, and it was produced in 2012 by a group called Terrapin Bright Green. In there, they suggested that designing well-lit, naturally vegetated, beautiful environments can really increase, or rather like we're doing within the Mobius project, can really create some incredible increases in working productivity by up to 15%, in learning comprehension rates by up to 20%. We can significantly decrease our staff attrition rates, and we can also reduce by about 10% absenteeism and sick days in work. Now, I'd like you to consider what that means to your company's bottom line in a world where employee salaries represent about 90% of your operating costs. And I think it raises a really important question about how it is that we choose to invest in, design, and build our urban infrastructure. And to me, the Mobius project represents a really amazing and positive first step solution in trying to solve a big problem like urban waste, a building that combines the very best of biophilic design principles with the biological system that takes in what we need less of, waste, to produce a great deal more of what we need, which is low carbon, locally grown, nutritious food. And all of this within a radically innovative working environment. But perhaps the most exciting thing for me about this project is the fact that it can be plugged into almost any building typology, whether it's schools, universities, hospitals, commercial developments, residential developments. All you need is a biological waste stream that's coming out of it, and you can plug this project in. And in my head, I have a vision for a world where urban environments have completely removed the notion of waste. And while some people might say to you, it's not possible, I think history has always been on the side of those who dream big. So, just before I leave you, I'd like to share with you a favorite quote of mine, which is by Paul Hawken. Forget that this task of planet saving is not possible in the time required. Don't be put off by people who know what is not possible. Do what needs to be done, and then check to see if it was impossible after you're finished. So let's all go out there and get on with the impossible. Thank you.